Welcome to Week 8 of Cloth Creation and Simulation for Real-Time. This week we'll cover texturing leather, soft fabrics like cotton, and shiny fabrics like nylon or silk. We'll cover how to layer your materials in a believable way, and how to damage them using anchor points and height information. Then we'll cover how to create fur using a few different methods. I'll talk a bit about posing your character, and how to use Marvelous Designer for even better results. This week you'll learn how to think procedurally while texturing your garments, techniques for making realistic fur, and how to finalize your piece. That's a lot to cover, so let's get started. Creating textures for our character is just like any other stage of the process. We want to start with our primary blocked-in shapes and work our way down to tertiary shapes. Usually to start in Painter, I like to go in and make sure that I have the color and roughness matching what I'm seeing in my reference and my concept. To do this, I'll start by adding a group node for whatever the material is. In this case, we have some black leather. And here inside the black leather coat, which I've instantiated to the lower half of this coat because I've split it into two materials. We can take a look at the base color, and you can see there's a very subtle top to bottom gradient. If we go into this upper layer, right now I just have flat color. Metallic value is at default. You can actually turn this off. Roughness I've dialed in to match the leather I'm seeing in my reference, though I will modify it with various texture maps, grunges, and procedurals to try to get something that looks much more realistic. Getting a base level of roughness is good for trying to figure out how it sits in with the rest of the character. The vertical gradient is kind of a trick. So I have a planar projected. You can change the projection type up here. Planar projected gradient that runs from top to bottom on this character and is just multiplying a darker color in the diffuse, or in this case, base color, because we're working with metal rough. I'm using this gradient as a ramp to kind of lead the viewer's eye back up into the torso where I have a lot of my detail and kind of away from the feet. This isn't strictly necessary, but I think it looks really nice. It also helps to ground the character in the world a little bit better, to have a bit of a gradient from top to bottom, since 90% of the time they will be lit from top to bottom. It helps to sell the sort of shadows around the feet. I also have a subtle noise multiplied over the top of this, because otherwise we get some pretty severe banding. If I turn it off, and we look at the base color, it's a little bit difficult to see here, but let's turn up the gradient all the way. You might be able to see the banding if it's coming through on the video. The noise just helps to break that up. And then I've set the percentage on this to 65. So as I'm creating these base color and roughness sort of starting points for each one of my materials, I'm thinking about a couple different things. Let's go through and turn them on. You'll notice that they're all fill layers. I work primarily with fill layers and almost never use paint layers because they can be procedural and edited very easily. Paint layers can have a lot of confusing information in them that may be difficult to track down. So there are a few things that I'm thinking about as I'm going through and adding my base roughness layers and color layers. One is what I'm seeing in the concept. So I try to match my colors to what I'm seeing in the concept, and you can actually use this color picker if you want to, but be careful as most concepts are lovingly rendered and have lots of different colors in them. So try to find a neutral one. A trick is to blur your concept and then pick from an average color based on that blur. The other thing I'm thinking about is contrast. Not only contrast in color and value, but contrast in roughness. having different roughness values helps to break up the character and really sell the different material properties of each piece of this garment. For instance, if we go ahead and look at the pants, we can turn on this fabric layer, which I have a lot going on in here, but I've got it all turned off. We're going to go over that in a little bit. The fabric base is much lighter here, so it contrasts nicely with this jacket, but it's also at 100% roughness. So it contrasts even further and helps to sell that this pant material is a softer cloth versus the more shiny leather of the coat. Go ahead and continue to turn on base layers here. Again, we're going to go into how this leather was made in a little bit. Now you can see that I wanted these two leathers to feel very different. Color-wise, they're not crazy different if we look at our base color. They're about the same value, it's just a slight shift in hue. Roughness-wise, they are very different. And if you want to get a feel for your roughness contrast without actually looking at the full material, looking at the contrast in the actual roughness textures can give you a great idea. If you're seeing a lot of homogeny, a lot of consistent values in your roughness, it's a good idea to try to figure out where you can add some breakup. Go to our gloves here. Once again, you can see that this leather is going to be very different from the leather that's on the jacket. It is much more rough and a lighter color. So we're going to make sure that looks very different. In the concept, it looks like a much harder leather. So we'll try to pull that off. The hat and the collar here are very similar, and they're very similar in the concept. So I might be okay with instancing what I have on the collar to the hat. Now the trims you've already seen, the textures I created for. I'll go ahead and turn these on. But I'll need to work on these as I worked on them separate from the rest of the garment without actually thinking about how it would work with the rest of the garment. So we can already see that the leather straps are too bright and kind of need to come down to match the belt that crosses his midsection. The rope is a little bit too bright, and the metal isn't really accurate for the time period. It's a little bit more like stainless steel at the moment, and it might make more sense to have it look like brass or silver, and maybe even give it some more ornate detail to kind of match with the theme of the character. Bloodborne has some very ornate detail in a lot of its designs. Now, the head here comes from 3D Scan Store. This is one of their HD heads, and it comes with some great textures already. Now I've gone ahead, and if we turn off the hat here, I've sculpted in a little bit of a facial expression on him, and added some additional details. I've shifted the eyes to be blue instead of brown because he is made up of so much leather that I wanted his eyes to kind of stand out a little bit. As you can see here. And I've done a little surgery on him to get him to fit into my existing costume here. If we go ahead and turn off the collar, you can see that his ears have been chopped off and his head has been kind of smushed into place to fit inside of this costume. Because the silhouette of the collar is so important to the look of the character, it's okay to kind of move your head around a little bit. There's a little bit of suspension of disbelief here, that the ears really would get pushed in a little bit. I probably should have shown the tips of them a little bit more. I may go back and modify that and show them a little bit more. But that's not really part of this course, the head stuff. But if you are interested in picking up one of these HD heads, I would highly recommend it just to look through it and see what a completed head looks like, and dig through the tool bag source information. So with all of this sort of set the way I want, with these base colors, I can go ahead and export everything over to my scene. And you'll notice I'm leaving everything at 2K for now. That's absolutely fine. And we'll go over into Toolbag and let it update here. Not much difference. I didn't change much, just a little bit in the boots here. So we can get an idea of how our initial roughness and color is looking on the character. There's not a lot of contrast in color on him, so I think I'm going to want to lighten the pants a little bit more. Now there's a tiling diffuse over the top of the pants that is darkening it quite a bit because it is on a multiply layer, so I could go in and reduce that. But otherwise, I think I'm pretty happy with the roughness contrast. That's looking pretty good. The next stage is to go in and start detailing specific types of materials and instantiating that across my different textures. And really starting to sell the makeup of each material to say that, yes, this coat is definitely a soft leather. This collar is a much harder leather. The pants are definitely made of some form of soft fabric, and so forth. So let's dive into how we would go about doing that. To start our detailed texturing process, let's dive into how to create leather. Now, the first thing I want to go over is just a little bit of the shader setup before we get into the actual creation of the textures here. So to start, I have a tiled normal map here, which looks something like this. If we turn off the albedo here, we can get kind of a better idea of what this looks like. It's a thicker, sort of soft leather that I'll be including for you to use in your project if you like. And I've set the weight to about halfway, and I've created a weight map here, which you can see blurs it out just a little bit on the edges, removes it from some of the high points where there's some wear. We'll go over creating that in a moment. Let's turn the albedo back on. Now I also have volumetric scattering set up. This just does a really nice job of picking up some light transmission from behind. I don't have it set too high because I don't want it to blur the normals too much. And I do have a mask here enabled. I'm using the green channel of the miscellaneous map, the M map. Currently it's empty, but we can use that to mask out any of the light transmission and scattering if we want to. We also have our roughness set up in the blue channel. Sort of toggle that on and off. See, there's not a whole lot of difference here, but it just helps to ground some of the connected pieces a little bit better. Especially in this region, it's a little bit hard to see because the scene's already fairly dark. But it does a good job of kind of making everything feel a little bit more cohesive. And then we have a tiling albedo with a map that matches the tiling normals, as you can see here. Using the same weight map and same amount of tiling. And there's a weight slider here for how intense that is. Once again, we can get a better look at that if we turn off our albedo here. And we can see what that is doing. It just helps to increase, like I said before, sort of the contrast with the base textures a little bit. And that's looking pretty nice. So let's go into Painter and look at how to craft these textures. Here we are in Painter with our leather textures on this collar. Let's go ahead and dive into the layer stack and see kind of what's going on here. So the first thing is I have my layer in a folder here just in case I want to instantiate this or if I want to create a smart material so I can use it on other parts of my garment. And let's just turn everything off and kind of walk up through the layer stack. So here we have the base color and roughness. And I have the blending mask set to white because I want the leather tiling texture to appear everywhere. Then I have a very subtle base color adjustment to add some variation in color. This is kind of my primary changes to this. I want a little bit of color variation. And what I'm using here is this Grunge Sand Dry. I'm going to rename the layer here. It used to be sort of a vein, marble vein texture. But this Grunge Sand Dry, which ships with Painter, works pretty well. I've dropped the balance back here to remove a little bit of detail. And we can take a look at what that effect is having here. And I've dropped the overall opacity of the diffuse component of this layer to pretty low, 5. With kind of a nice saturated sort of peachy color here that's just sort of lightly poking through to give a little bit of color variation. We can see that the balance just increases the contrast a little bit in the mask. So it looks pretty good. From a full textured standpoint, it's not super noticeable, it's subtle. And subtle is kind of the key word here. We don't want any of our moves to be really dramatic. We want kind of our baked information, all the work we put into making a nice high res to kind of drive a lot of what's going on here. With that in mind, I added a lighter edge here, which has a color component, a height component, some roughness, and removes some detail from the blending mask. So if we look at the blending mask, you can see that the black areas are where that tiling normal is not going to appear. So this is where some of the wear, natural wear might occur. And I've created this mask using one of my favorite smart masks that ships with Painter. It's called Subtle Scratches. And ironically, this uses the metal edge wear generator and just applies a sharpen filter onto it, which uses the curvature that we've baked to get some nice breakup here. We can see in the base color we're getting just kind of a nice light, sort of almost a purpley color on top of our dark brown, which you can see is kind of hinted at here in the concept. There's this kind of lighter purpley edge going on. So I've made it definitely more subtle than it is in the concept. And the roughness component is really helping to separate it from the base. As we increase the roughness here, you can really start to see the contrast in that. Especially if you look up here, it's sort of where the collar folds over the face. You can really see that starting to break up that edge highlight. And so this is where some natural wear might occur. Having it baked onto specific folds probably isn't great, because chances are good that it's not going to have these folds all of the time. So it's a good idea to kind of go through and add a paint layer and just set your flow very low on your brush. Make sure you're painting black and just kind of subtly paint out some areas a little bit. And you can even adjust the intensity on that paint layer if you want to. With the idea being that, these probably aren't going to be there all the time, so they may not wear as much as some other portions of this. Like this top area here might wear even more, so if we wanted to, we could paint in a little bit more. And you could use more of an artistic brush. I generally will stick to the soft default brush, and it works fairly well. I actually like it quite a bit with it actually on those baked in folds, so I'm going to go ahead and leave it. So the next stage, I wanted to make sure I had some kind of leather looking material on this. Now we are going to use that tiling normal map, but I wanted just a little bit more information that is going to read a little bit better from further away. The tiling information is really for when you get kind of close. So I wanted something that was kind of soft and a little bit more of like a raw leather. So let's take a look at this somewhat complicated texture here. So to start, I've gone ahead and selected all of the areas that I want this texture to appear in, just using the UV chunk fill and selecting different panels. So I've actually selected all of the panels here. The reason I didn't just drop a white fill layer is because I wanted to use this bevel filter, which is going to grab all of these areas here. Let's see if we add just a white fill. We don't get any pickup on the bevel. It doesn't understand what I'm trying to bevel, right? If we go ahead and look at our textures here. These look almost identical, but if we were able to see the sort of negative space of this texture, you would see with the paint here that in between all of these UV islands, it's actually black, versus this fill, the entire thing is white, right? So when we bevel, there's an edge we can pick up on and we can bevel. And I really wanted to ignore the edges and fill the sort of center pieces of each island. And I went ahead and blurred that a little bit just to soften that even more. Bevel's soften component or smoothing component works fairly well, but it still can give kind of a harder edge. So I went in and blurred it as well. Just a very subtle blur. And then added some grunge on top of this in a multiply layer. And left this pretty default balance of 50%, scale at 1, just using UV projection. From there, I used the levels to invert because I realized looking at my leather reference that in a lot of cases, the core section of leather gets worn a little bit, and some of the sort of cracks and crevices and skin detail of whatever hide of whatever creature this came from, if it was cowhide or whatever, gets worn away. The more this thing gets used, the more it's tanned as part of the process to change the color. You'll generally get some smoother portions actually more towards the interior and some harder portions on the exterior. So I went ahead and inverted that. If we go ahead and take a look here, you can see what that's doing. We have sort of a more shiny interior as we flip this around, and a rougher sort of exterior. So next I went ahead and multiplied this grunge leather damage texture that Painter ships with, and actually looks quite good. I went ahead and increased the scale to 2, and just multiplied this over the top. So now, in all of these areas, I'm going to start to get this leather look. And it's a little bit less towards the core, and a little bit more on the edges, because of this initial setup of this mask I created. So then I created an anchor point, and you can do this by right-clicking and saying Add Anchor Point, and you can name it whatever you like. And I'll show you why I created that anchor point in a little bit. But what this is essentially doing is saving this state of my mask. So it's everything below this is being saved into this anchor point, and I can reference this anywhere above this stack in other layers. But I'll show you what I'm going to do with this in a second. So next I multiplied some curvature over the top, where I mostly want this to be in the cavities. I don't want this to be in sort of the raised sections. So I inverted my curvature and adjusted the blur here a little bit, just to get a little bit of blur on that, soften it. And you can go in and adjust the individual components of your curvature here using this curvature generator. It uses the baked curvature, and then you can kind of adjust the different levels of detail of your curvature. Then I went ahead and blurred the entire texture. And the reason I'm doing this is because I noticed that this feels really hard, right? It looks really contrasty, very sharp look. So as soon as we introduce the blur, that really softens it, but we're losing a little bit of detail. So what am I going to do? I'm going to fill with this anchor point I made down here and multiply that back over the top. And now we have kind of the best of both worlds. We have some softening, and we also have the more intense crevice being multiplied back over the top. And if we look at the mask, if we turn this off, we get the blur. If we turn off the blur, it's very sharp. And when we turn that blur on, we maintain the hard core of this and then get a sort of blurred fall off. That's kind of what I'm trying to create here, and the way I added that back in is just to add a fill layer. Instead of searching under the resources, go to the anchor points and add this leather tile mask and multiplied it on. Then I can adjust the intensity of that core with my opacity slider. So that's looking pretty good. Side benefit is that this has a little bit of damage built into it, which is nice. You may not want that. There's a different texture that comes with Painter called Grunge Leather, which is not damaged, which is going to remove those points of damage. It looks a little bit different. We can adjust the balance a little bit, give this a different look. Of course, you can make your own in Substance Designer or download a pattern that you like. Those are options as well. But I really like this damage one. I think it looks pretty good. So let's continue. The next layer is an edge damage layer, which looks fairly subtle here. If we go ahead and look at the stack here, I started with the curvature generator, and I just wanted these medium details here. You can see if we increase these, it gets a little bit more contrasted, has a little bit more information to it, but I wanted it to be fairly soft. I added a blur here to even increase that softness, and then multiplied a grunge scratch over the top of it. You can kind of see those scratches coming in very subtly. And then once again, I've kind of used my anchor points here. So this is another use case of the anchor point. If you are noticing that you're not very happy with how the edges are broken up on your either painted or generated mask, you can create an anchor point, and I've named it Edge Damage Mask. And then above that, go ahead and blur it or do a bevel to increase the size. We can make this more dramatic if we apply levels here and increase the size of the mask. Multiply a grunge over the top of it to really knock it back quite a bit and get a lot of breakup. And then bring our mask back as a linear dodge layer, which is going to bring back the core of this damage. And right now you can see it's not having a huge effect because I'm only making some adjustment here in the height. And if we actually go to the height layer stack, the intensity is set to only 10%. If we sort of bring this back up, we can see what this looks like. So it brings back the core of that damage and breaks up the edge of this initial painted damage. Remove that levels component. And you can see it works really well here as well, even without that levels component, to sort of expand out. If I bring that back, so the levels here can be used to control how far outside of the initial painted mask we're getting that sort of edge breakup. So I can set my intensity for that back to 10, which as you can see is just adding a little bit more damage to some of these raised edges, and especially down here at the edge of my leather here where it was maybe cut, gets a nice sort of breakup there. So after that, I was looking at my reference and noticed that in some cases we get some peeling where leather gets sort of peeled back after sort of years of use. You can see a little bit of it on this collar here in the Brotherhood of the Wolf. So I added a layer for some peeling. This doesn't hold up fairly well at a really close distance, but it does work at my sort of render distance. If I was really worried about that, I could go in and set my shader to 4096 instead, or tile this peeling a little bit less. But let's take a look at this peeling layer. So the first thing I did was add this grunge concrete cracked procedural, which comes in like this, and I inverted it so that I had these cracks as what I'm actually, showing in my layer, and moved the balance up a little bit and increased the contrast so that I'm only getting those major cracks. From there, I blurred it just a little bit and ran a levels on it to increase the intensity. So when we blur something, we're creating some gray pixels outside of the core of whatever our mask is here. And we can use levels to adjust those gray pixels really easily. If we don't blur this, you can see the mask itself has a very different look in the levels. This works, but it kind of maintains its size, right? We're just getting more detail out of it. With the blur, we can actually go in and we can adjust the actual size. It gets thicker as we're pulling down on these white points in the levels. I'm using this to kind of make the cracks a little bit thicker. Next, I use a histogram scan, which is actually very similar to a levels, to increase the contrast even more and kind of pull out some of those gray points. So if we go ahead and look at, first we do the levels, which increases the thickness a little bit, and then the histogram scan sharpens it up. Then I created an anchor point. So everything below this has been saved. At this point, you might have noticed that this is fairly sharp. And hopefully you remember what I did before when I was thinking something looked a little bit too sharp. So above this anchor point, I go ahead and bevel and then apply a grunge. So if we look at this, we have a bevel with a grunge multiplied over the top, and a levels ran on that to pull out some gray values. And then I go ahead and fill back in my peeling mask. And now we have sort of a softer, broken up edge on the outside of this peel mask. And we can adjust kind of how far out that goes by adjusting the bevel here. We can make it go further. We can increase the smoothness and reduce the sort of contrast in between each section. That's looking pretty good. So I have all these cracks all over, but they're everywhere, right? And I don't really want them to be everywhere. I only really want them to be in areas that are going to consistently wear and bend, because these cracks are going to appear wherever this leather is really bending quite a bit and being pulled apart to create these cracks. So I used a mask editor. Mask editor is a very detailed filter or generator that allows us to take a lot of our baked information and use it in interesting ways. So here you can see I have the ambient occlusion inverted, and I have the blending mode set to linear dodge so that it is added to the mask. It's additive. While the mask itself, the mask editor itself, is set to multiply. So it's removing some areas, right? So If we set this to normal and we could just take a look at what this mask is doing, go ahead and turn off the curvature opacity for a second. So here we have the inverted ambient occlusion, right? So all of the areas that would be black on the ambient occlusion are white because I want that peeling damage to appear in those areas. Because these are areas that are going to kind of stretch like underneath of a fold. Generally, if that fold is made many, many times, then you know that the fabric has been bent there, or the leather has been bent there to create this peeling. So I've inverted the ambient occlusion, and instead of having the blending mode at normal, I've changed it to linear dodge. So then under curvature here, if I turn this up, you can see I have the mode set to dual. By default, it's set to edges, so we're only getting raised edges. You can change it to cavities and just get the cavity portions, which again is going to be that area underneath of the folds where it's kind of scrunched, so we could keep it there. But I kind of liked dual because if we set this back to multiply, we were getting it a little bit on some of the raised edges as well. So cavities, it's sort of bound to inside of the recessed portion of the folds, and then dual is giving me on top of the folds as well as in the core. But because of this ambient occlusion that I have up here set to linear dodge, we're getting even more in the crevices than we're getting in the raised portions. And so with that set to multiply, everything that's black here is going to punch out some of that peeling detail. And now we have peeling detail only where we want it. Pretty nice. So I wanted to break up the edges even more and get almost like a stippling going on the edges, which is what this is doing. You can kind of see it here. Let's take a look at how I did that. So the first thing I did was create a UV border generator. This only works if you have all of your panels cut out the way that I do, where each section where I would actually want the edge stippling to appear is actually a UV border. This generator is really useful. You can adjust the balance of this mask, the smoothness of it, how far away it is from the UV border. Very useful for things like little folds, which I'll show you in a minute, which I've actually also added to this. I didn't want any smoothness yet because I wanted to kind of be able to control this separately from this generator. And I've just set the edge distance fairly low and the balance high so that it is a very consistent mask. Then I've gone ahead and blurred it and multiplied Dirt 5, which you'll see I come back to Dirt 5 quite a bit. It's a very useful texture. But I'm just multiplying this over the top of that existing mask so I can get my stippling. And then I'm blurring that. If I don't blur this, and we crank the height channel quite a bit, you can see it's got a lot of variation in detail, and it's very intense. If we go ahead and blur it, it really softens that up. But it's way too intense, and I wasn't really happy with that, so I just went into the height layer stack and turned down the intensity of this layer. Now I'm getting that sort of edge stippling, which looks nice. The reason for that being that most likely when this leather was created, it was probably kind of ripped a little bit. Now, what I should have done in my high poly is maybe break up this edge a little bit more. It's a little bit too consistent, and I can always go back and change that. I may do that. But this edge stippling creates some interesting wear, which is nice. If I wanted to, I could go even further. And let's do that in a moment. Before we do that, let's go ahead and look at some folds I created here. So currently these have a very low impact. Let's take a look at what these are doing. So I have two different types of folds here. And you can see as I toggle them on and off, you can see they're pretty intense in some areas. And I've used the same technique as I did for the stippling here, where to start, I'm using my UV border distance generator. I've got the smoothness at max, and I set the balance kind of high, just so that it's not deteriorating as it gets closer to that border. It maintains its sort of brightness all the way through. And then I've painted out areas where I don't want the horizontal folds to appear. Don't do this. Let's take a look. You can see I'm getting horizontal folds on an area where I actually want vertical folds, right? So I've painted those out very simply. And then blurred this to erode the edge a little bit, just a little bit too intense. And then multiplied this stock texture, creases soft, as you can see here. And under the parameters, I've adjusted the frequency to 12, and you can adjust sort of how many folds there are going on. And we can take a look at what that looks like. All right, now you have to be very subtle with this, because as you can see here, this just looks strange. It looks a little over the top. We can pull the frequency back, but it's still a little bit too intense. We could reduce the sharpness of the folds or increase them, depending on what look we're going for. But what I ended up doing is just turning down this height layer somewhere around 60%, which is giving me those folds, but they're fairly subtle. I think the frequency is a little bit too high. Let's go back in. You have to be very careful with this, because it can look generated. We don't want it to look generated, right? Even though it is generated, we want it to look natural. But this is just giving me some more folds that I wish I had time to do in ZBrush, but are fairly quick to do here and look fairly nice. And I've UV'd my collar here in such a way that I can do this. So I did the same thing vertically. The only difference here is that instead of painting out the vertical portions, I've painted out the horizontal portions, blurred it, and applied that creasing again. And we can go ahead and modify the balance so that it matches with the changes I just made to the other side. I wanted these to be a little bit more subtle because it just made sense that since the major folds are kind of running horizontally, that I wanted the horizontal folds to be a little bit more intense than the vertical folds that are running up. From there, I went ahead and just made a holes layer that goes in and adds some holes where the ties are sort of coming into the base of the collar. And this is done very simply just with a soft brush and a little bit of a blur, which reduces the height and darkens the ambient occlusion. So if we look at the ambient occlusion, there's some holes there. And we can see the height adjustment at a distance. It looks fairly good. In several of these layers, I've added a mask for the tiling normal map and albedo map that is going to make up sort of the leather look of this. Now you can see that I really don't want that tiling to appear on where it's peeling up. I don't want it to appear on areas where there's some wear. And I do want to see it in areas that are sort of a little bit smoother and haven't had as much wear. And at an initial glance, this looks pretty good. However, it's not very noticeable in Toolbag. Here you can see that it is indeed removed very slightly from where this wear appears, but it's not incredibly noticeable. Now, if we want to increase the contrast of this without having to go through every single layer and adjust the values, we can create a pass-through layer. So this is just an empty layer. There's nothing in it, set to pass through with the levels on it. And the levels is going to adjust everything that's below it in the layer stack because of this pass-through blending mode. So I can go ahead and crank up the contrast of this blending mask, and we can re-export our MISC map here, where that mask lives in the red channel. And now in Toolbag, we can see a very different situation here. The blending mask is very high contrast. So it's a little bit higher contrast than I would like it to be, so we can go back and go ahead and reduce the contrast just a little bit. And now we have a little bit more subtle blending mask here. Let's talk a little bit about material layering. In some instances, you might want to have one type of material directly on top of another. For instance, with this leather, many types of leather have a sort of hide on the underside that is the untreated form of the leather. Wax hasn't been applied to it. It's usually much softer and rough, and might even still have a little bit of like a fur fuzz on it. So that's kind of what I've tried to replicate here, and I've done that by using the built-in leather rough material on this base hide group. And I've added some normal components here. I've added a little bit of height for some pulls and some fuzz, just sort of a generic white noise to get something that looks kind of like a fuzz. Obviously, without some sort of velvet shader, it's not really going to look like fuzz, but that's okay for now. We can say maybe it was partially treated. Then I have my black leather, which is going to sit on top. Now, in the height stack, I've gone ahead and set the leather here to normal instead of linear dodge. Linear dodge is default. I've set it to normal. And let me show you why. If I set this back to linear dodge, you can see those height elements that I added to that material start to poke through. We want to set this to normal so that we flatten out the height as soon as we get into our black leather material. What I've also had to do is add a height component to the base layer of my black leather. And I'm just going to set this to 0.1. So with that done, now we need to make a mask, essentially, where we want this hide to maybe appear. Now, it would normally be on the backside, but it might start to creep in along the edges if it wasn't really tanned properly, right? Or if like this specific piece was tanned and it wasn't cut from a larger sheet. So let's go ahead and create this mask. I'm going to start with a flat white because I want the black leather to be covering 99% of this material. From there, I'm going to create a UV border generator. And what this is going to do is start to black out just the UV border edges of this material and start to reveal that hide material underneath. But it's looking a little bit too uniform, so I'm going to go ahead and warp it. Warp is a great way to break up rigid lines and get some more interest going on. So what I've done here is I've increased the blur a little bit. By default, it might look something like this. So I've increased the blur a little bit and the source tiling to sort of warp the edge. You can see it has a very subtle effect here. Then I'm going to go ahead and create an anchor point and save everything below this in the stack for later. Then I use a linear dodge grunge here. If we set this to normal, we can see what it looks like. It's just a lot of scratches and dirt called grunge scratches dirty. And if we set this to linear dodge, we're going to eat away at the edges of this mask, right? But now the nice crisp edge that we sort of had created from the UV border distance is missing. So we can bring that back using our anchor point. The nice part about anchor points is when you drop them in, it comes with a levels adjustment. So we can take this and adjust how far out and how sharp the mask is. Of course, if we want it to go even further, we can go into our UV border distance here, and we can push the distance out further. But we want to keep it kind of constrained to the edge. From there, I kind of stray from my procedural nature and add a paint layer here. And what this is doing is just going in with a very soft, low flow, white brush, starting to just paint back some of this damage here. And I've removed it from most of the core here of the collar, and I just kind of have it at these. So now we're getting some of that untanned hide coming through. And we have full control over what that material looks like. We can turn off this and we can make changes here. We can say, okay, I actually want this to be a little bit more saturated or something like that. I want to tile this fuzz more, whatever that might be. And I also want to make sure that at a base level, this does not have the tiling leather texture on it. So I'm just going to add this blending mask layer here and set it to black. So we can put our black leather back on top. Now that's looking nice. We're getting a little bit of a sort of material blend here. Let's go ahead and peek at our blending mask and make sure that that's working correctly. It is. Our ambient occlusion is working correctly. If we wanted to, we could also take the ambient occlusion here and drop that down a little bit inside of this base hide. And then above here in the base for the black leather, I will replace the ambient occlusion with baked map and set my layer mode back to normal. I need to set the group folder to normal as well. And now the lower level here has a darker ambient occlusion, giving it sort of even more of a separation between these two layers. And now we can go ahead and export this to Toolbag and take a look at it. Here we have our nice material blend with this rough, sort of brighter hide edge. Next, let's talk about texturing cloth. At the base here, we have color and roughness, and we have the blending mask set to white because we want our tiling texture, which is going to be a fabric texture, tiling over the entirety of it. From here, I've gone ahead and added some lighter color around the knees. Go ahead and solo here and look at our base color. You can see that it is very subtly added, where we'll get some general wear around sort of the front of the leg just from use normal day to day. I've turned it down pretty low, about 13%, but we could try increasing that a little bit. Now, the mask here is not straightforward. If we go ahead and turn all these off, you can see first I've just gone ahead and painted in with a low flow brush where I want this to appear. Next, I blurred it a little bit and created an anchor point. Then I multiplied an anisotropic noise. Anisotropic noise works really well for fabric. It's very good for creating heathering and breaking up the general color of soft fabrics like cotton. Here I've increased the Y amount to a fairly large number. You can see what this does here. And the X amount to look a little bit more like heathering and a little less like lines. Then I go ahead and add my color adjust mask, which I made below, back in to fill it out where the anisotropic noise is taking away. So that way I'm just really getting that anisotropic breakup around the edges or the gray values. Then I multiplied a directional noise over the top just to get a little bit of general breakup across the entire thing, and then blurred it a little bit. You'd like to bring that down. Just because I was noticing it too much here. If we turn this blur off, you can really see that anisotropic noise very significantly. So I turned that down quite a bit by blurring it. Next, I added the fabric rough material from inside. The fabric rough material that ships with Painter. This works really well for, like it says, rough fabrics. It gives you a tiling texture to begin with, which you can turn off if you want to. I like it because at a distance it reads really nice. You're getting just a little bit of subtle breakup in the diffuse. The height component is a little bit less desirable. We could pull that out, but for now I decided to leave it and see how it ends up looking. It might clash a little bit with my tiling normal map. So from there I add some heathering across the entire garment. And like I said, this is just using some anisotropic noise. And I have the intensity set fairly low. If we turn it up, we can see what it looks like. I'm actually doing this at a darker value. For now, I'm going to go ahead and actually increase the amount of X tiles to make it look a little bit more like heathering. Just increase the variation just a little bit more. And then I will turn this back down. Next, I like to add some pilling, where the fibers kind of get stuck together and sort of rounded over each other and lifted off the surface a little bit. This works in conjunction with the tiling normal map really well. It just helps to break up the tile and make it feel a little bit more unique. Now this is just using my favorite Dirt 5, with the balance dropped a little bit lower and then tiled a bit more so that there's larger and smaller pulls going on here. And then it's blurred out just a little bit. So if we take a look at that, turn off the blur, here we have our larger pulls, our smaller pulls coming in. And then to soften it all out, just a little bit of a blur. Next, I started to add some runs in the fabric where it actually gets sort of pulled up. You'll see this often on denim. If I toggle this, you can kind of see what's happening here. There's a color component and a height component. And the height is currently going the wrong direction. But we want it to kind of be lifted from the surface. Where a single thread maybe gets grabbed on something, and then as it pulls up, it unravels from the rest of the cloth. So go ahead and turn that height component back down a little bit. And we can take a look at what this layer looks like. So I start with stripes that are just tiled across in the U direction. And we can adjust the number of stripes here. And these are going to act as my runs or pulls in the fabric. And from there, I went ahead and warped it just a little bit. If we zoom in, we can kind of see what this warp is doing. It's just breaking up the consistency of this line. And we could take this a little bit further if we wanted to. We can adjust the source parameters and blur it a little bit and increase the tiling and make this even more sort of wobbly. Then I multiply an anisotropic noise. If I set this to normal, we can see what it looks like. It's a fairly large tile here, just to sort of knock back how many runs there are. Obviously, if the entire thing has runs, that's not going to look quite right if we look at the texture here. It's an interesting look for sure, and you could give it a shot, but removing some of them and just having a few runs starts to look good. Then I did the same thing again, just with a increased tile on this. So here it's at 18, and here it's at 15. Again, just knocking back the number a little bit and then a third one here that is actually rotated 90 degrees. Often when you'll see these poles, they won't be consistent. There will be kind of like stops and gaps between each one. And as we kind of like add this back in, it starts to look a little bit more natural. From there, I know I didn't want it to be over the entire garment, so I added a UV border distance generator to just squeeze this in along the UV borders, and I inverted it so that I was just getting the core here. If we set this to normal, we can see sort of what this looks like. Obviously, I have my UV borders here, and I've increased this dramatically and inverted it, and then multiplied so that I'm only getting these poles here kind of on the front of the leg and the backs of the legs. Then over the top of that, I added this Grunge Dirt Muddy at a fairly low scale with triplanar, just to sort of break it up even more. It's a little bit too consistent, so breaking it up even more. And now it's fairly subtle unless you're sort of looking at it from a glancing angle, but we do have these sort of striped poles here that get pulled up. Now, this is kind of contingent on your UVs being vertical here, right? And square. If they're not square, then you're going to get these poles going in a certain direction. Now, if I look at the height component here, and we really increase that so we can see it here, you can see I do actually have a bit of a curve to this. And if we look at the UVs, part of the reason for that is that I haven't fully straightened out this UV island. I'm okay with that, but it's something you want to think about before you really start diving into your textures. You may want to re-UV and redo your bakes if you want to be able to sort of tile stuff perfectly vertically with your garments. So we'll bring that height component back down. Next, I added some fuzz. And this is just some dots of a lighter color. I'm using Grunge Shavings here, and you can kind of see what that looks like. And then multiplying Grunge Dirt Scratchy over the top of it so that I'm only getting this sort of shavings look in a few areas. It's sort of randomly scattered across, and you can see it kind of come through here. Just looks like some fuzz that has sort of attached itself to this softer fabric, maybe floating on the breeze and got stuck to our. Then I started adding some additional wrinkles. So to start, I added just a general pass of wrinkles. And this is very similar to how I did the leather wrinkles. I'm just placing this creases soft, increased the tile to 2, adjusted the frequency to 66 to work with my UVs, and then blurred it. If I don't blur it, it looks a little bit too intense. So that just knocks it back, it softens it, and helps it sink into the garment a little bit better. And then brought the height component down significantly, somewhere around 30%, looks pretty good. I called these general wrinkles because I kind of just let them be everywhere. It just adds a little bit more interest on the shadows, or when you're looking at it at a glancing angle, just adds a little bit more. So next I added some seam wrinkles. And you have to be really subtle with these. I have them turned up all the way so we can take a look, but I'm going to turn them down just a little bit. And what this is doing is adding wrinkles specifically at the seams. And I'm using the UV seams here, once again, just like I did with the leather, where we have the UV border distance. And then I'm adding in some curvature because I want it to appear on the raised edges. And then I'm blurring to sort of mix the curvature and the UV seams together. And then multiplying this creases soft over the top of it once again. And it's nice because we do get a lot of control over this. Like we can increase the frequency or decrease it. And the sharpness, all that kind of stuff. We could even blur this if we wanted to. We could take this to be really sharp and high frequency, and then go ahead and blur it again. It's not too bad. Now, what I need to do on top of this is also paint out some areas where I don't want this to appear, because if it's all the way across this, it's going to look a little bit odd. So we need to just sort of knock back some of it. Once again, with a very soft brush, just going in, pulling out some of these wrinkles. I'm going to do the same thing on this general wrinkles, and think about the same way I would think about creating wrinkles in ZBrush. Where are my tension points, and where should the folds be coming from? So if I have zigzag folds here, they're going to probably terminate where I can see these muscles starting to come through. So I'm going to add a paint layer to my mask, set the color to black, and just gently sort of paint out some of these general wrinkles from the front here, where we're getting these the same tension that we're seeing these radiating folds from the middle. It's sort of starting to come in. We'll just paint those out a little bit. On the back, I think we could leave them. We might want to remove them from the butt a little bit. Now that's looking a little bit more natural and a little less procedural. Nice. Okay. So the next thing I added is a creases layer. And what this is a UV border distance with some blur on it. And I painted out this pocket area because I didn't want it to be affected. You can see kind of what it's doing here. But this is just increasing the intensity of my seam lines. And you can see that I have my seam lines lined up with my UV border edges, so this works really well. And I just wanted to get a little bit more intensity out of these seams. Another trick we might want to do is remove the seam lines from our tiling texture. We don't want the fabric to just cross over that seam line. We want there to be a little bit of a separation there. So we can go into our blending mask here and turn that down. And let's take a look at the blending mask. So right now the poles are removed from the blending mask and these border edges. So the last thing I'll do is add a lighting pass to the diffuse. If we go ahead and turn this on, we can see what it is. First, I've added some curvature, and I've set the blending mode to overlay. If we set this to normal, you can see what it looks like. There's a little bit of a bake error here. I need to rebake my curvature map here. But I have this set to overlay and about 25%. And then there's just a kiss of ambient occlusion in at 15%. And I was planning on adding a little bit of wear, but I ended up removing that. So you can see as I toggle this, it just sort of has the insets a little bit darker and the folds a little bit lighter. They just kind of pop out at you a little bit more. It's very subtle. It's turned down enough that you're not going to notice it if the lighting changes, being lit from the wrong direction. So with all of that, let's go ahead and export over to Toolbag. So this is looking pretty good. The shader is currently set up to use volumetric scattering and has the fuzz component turned on to sort of simulate the fuzz of cloth. Now, Another method we could use, of course, is the microfiber shader, and that might get us some better results, but I wanted the softness of the scattering here to sort of come into play. Sort of dial that in, and we can mask it off if we need to in some areas, but it doesn't look too bad. Everything's looking quite nice. Now, the tiling information is not currently on, so let's go ahead and do that now. I'm going to go ahead and turn up my detail weight here. Start to see some of this tiling information coming through. Let's try setting it to 2. It looks like the tiling information and the baked-in information are competing a little bit, which isn't great. Let's take a look at the diffuse component of the tiling. I'll go ahead and turn up the weight. You can see we're starting to get this sort of almost crisscross pattern going on, where the fabric rough material that we added and the tiling information are kind of at odds with each other. So let's go ahead and remove some of that. Alternatively, we could use a different tiling pattern. That would also work, but I'm kind of partial to this one for this type of fabric, this sort of twill tiling. So let's go ahead and pull out some of that fabric rough. Go ahead and scroll down to fabric rough here, and let's try just removing it from the height channel. See what kind of effect that has. From a distance here, it looks pretty nice having some of that. We could also try rotating this 90 degrees to have more of a vertical look that sort of matches with some of the pulls that we added. So why don't we try that? Go ahead and re-export. And that is looking a little bit better. Can turn up the detail weight here a little bit. So they're still competing. I'm going to go ahead and just remove it entirely. I'll take the base color component and just go ahead and drop this. Now, this is lightening this quite a bit because the fabric rough was so dark. I'm going to drop this to somewhere around 20%, and then take my fabric base here and drop it very slightly. I'm also going to add in a little bit of saturation because I'm noticing it feels a little bit desaturated in Toolbag. Let's go ahead and export again. There we go. That's looking nice. We can see the tiling of the detail maps here. Got a little bit more saturation going on in the color. It's looking nice. You can adjust the normal intensity here and the weight. What we might want to do is add a little bit of breakup in the texture map for our detail weight here. You can see it's pretty consistent. Why don't we add just a little bit of breakup into that to make it feel a little bit more natural. I'll go ahead and jump back over to Painter. And at the top of my stack here, I'm going to go ahead and add a fill layer and Alt-click to just get the mask component here and set that to black. And I'll call this layer blending mask. And I'm going to apply a black mask. Let's take a look at it. And I'm going to add a generator, and I want the mask editor. By default, this gives us pretty much just a curvature map. The first thing I'm going to do is start dropping out some of the detail of the larger forms in the curvature here, because I really only want this to start appearing in the smaller parts of the curvature. where I want to remove some of the detail. I'm also going to set the mode to cavities because I want it to remove in the cavities, not in the raised portions. This is just a look preference. There's not really a rhyme or reason to this. Mostly it's I want to pull it out of the seams that are sort of pushed in, especially here around this fly seam. You can see it kind of like pulling it out there. And if we wanted to, we could have like a position gradient of some kind, or on the world space normals, we could say we want to remove it from perhaps from the bottom, but I'm not going to do that for now. Let's take a look at the ambient occlusion and let's invert this and set it to linear dodge. Not quite what we want because of the proximity here is causing some issues with that rather than just giving us kind of the bottom side of the fold. So I'll go ahead and set this to 0. And we can add in a couple of textures here if we want to. Go ahead and invert this texture. And the textures are currently empty, so let's go ahead and add some kind of grunge here. Let's try dirt. Maybe this time we'll use dirt 4, change it up a little bit. And we'll go back up to our texture settings here. And we'll set this to, instead of overlay, linear dodge. And then I'm going to drop the scale pretty significantly. And I don't want to invert this. And I'm going to set the opacity kind of lower, somewhere in this range. I really just want some random breakup here a little bit. And the curvature is looking a little too intense, so I'm going to trade some curvature for some of this texture. I just don't want it to be too high contrast. So now if we go ahead and look at the blending mask itself, we've got a little bit more dark spots in here. We can turn this up a little bit more and maybe just the contrast on this. We don't want it to be perfectly black because we do still want some tiling to come through. We just want it to be a little bit more subtle. So let's go ahead and export that. So we can see the effect of this. It's a little bit too, it looks a little bit too much like stains. And it's a little too high contrast, so we can adjust that. Go back to our layer here, go to our blending mask, and I'm just going to take the whole thing and turn this down. Let's try that. That's much better. Much more subtle. We're still getting a lot of the tiling information in here. And we can mess around with the fuzz component to make it feel a little bit softer. And that's looking pretty good. Next, let's talk about texturing some shinier fabric like a polyester. Before I dive into some texture tips for silk and shinier fabrics like nylon, let's go ahead and look at the shader setup in Toolbag. To begin, I have a tiling detail normal map. If we zoom in here, we can take a look. That looks somewhat like nylon. It's definitely not perfect, but it's fairly close and looks correct at a distance. And that's kind of what I care about. This is being masked out by the red channel of the MISC map. Same thing with the leather. We have our albedo, and I'm currently using the microfiber to get a little bit of a sheen here, which I've set to a value very similar to the albedo's sort of general color here, but a little bit brighter so that we can actually see it. And I've got the sheen tint turned all the way up, which is going to pull from the albedo a little bit. And I've got this set around 0.4 just to get a little bit of sheen on there. I have the reflection set to anisotropic instead of GGX. The anisotropy is about at 0.7. So if we set this to 0, this is approximating GGX, which is what you're going to see in Painter. You won't see this anisotropy in Painter unless you set it up in the shader. And then this is full anisotropy, which is a little bit too intense and actually makes it look quite glossy. So I've knocked it back to about 0.7, which looks pretty nice. And I've set the direction to 45 degrees. So we have our roughness and metalness, the occlusion, and then tiling albedo. So let's go ahead and take a look at the texture process. To start here in Painter, we can go over to our shader settings. And if you're using the ASM Metal Rough, you can scroll down to the base surface and enable anisotropy. There are maps that control this in Painter. So if we go up to our channels here, we can add an anisotropy level and angle map into our shader. So we'll go ahead and do that. And on this base layer here, we'll just go ahead. We'll set the level to about the same as we have it in Toolbag. And then we can adjust the angle here to try to reach our 45 degrees. I believe that the anisotropy angle here should be in radians. However, just simply converting our 45-degree angle to radians is not going to give us an accurate representation here, so we just kind of have to eyeball it. I'm not entirely sure what this value is. I'm sure that there's documentation on Painter's website, but we'll just go ahead and try to dial it in so it's fairly similar. This looks like about 45 degrees, and then we can go ahead and dial our roughness back in to where it was, and that should start to look more correct. So with that done, the next step I have is a very subtle roughness variation layer here. Now I have a jacket very similar to this that I put on as I was doing this texturing to sort of take a look at it. And there's kind of a speckle that you can see in the reflection, sort of like dots of brighter reflection and darker reflection. What that is actually the fibers the jacket is made of. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the resolution to support this. Ideally, a tileable gloss map would be able to do this best. But in this case, I just used a white noise and roughness with the scale set to 2 or 3 and dropped the opacity of the roughness until it was fairly subtle at a distance. And that looks pretty good. From there, I applied Fabric Rough, and we're only using the diffuse component. Again, this is Fabric Rough, which is a stock material that ships with Painter. You can find it here. And I've turned the base color down to about 29 and set it to multiply. And I have the color set to sort of a light gray. So if we set this all the way up, you can see that it's basically a multiply of a fabric texture. And as we sort of pull this back down, we're just getting a little bit of horizontal variation in the texture. This fought with the tiling normals of the pants because that had a bit of direction to it. The tiling normal we have here is going to be a little bit more forgiving. From there, I went ahead and added some memory folds from an alpha that I created, which is one of the ones that I included for you guys during the sculpting process. I've just applied this as a height map, which you can find here. And I've gone ahead and set the height value down to 51. So I'm just getting a little bit of normal information for some memory fold. Then I added some creasing to the UV seams, which is very similar to the same thing I did for the leather. So we can go ahead and take a look at this. Once again, this is a UV border distance. The smoothing up just a little bit. Pushed out a little bit, about 0.8 away from the edge. With the balance a little bit higher than 0.5. And with the creases soft, multiplied over the top. Now I have set this to triplanar instead of UV projection because some of these folds are a little bit undesirable to me. So triplanar gives a little bit of a better result, in my opinion. And it also helps to create a consistent size for the folds between these two different texture sets that I have here. You can see we don't have the anisotropy on the hood right now, so we could go to our texture set list and go to the hood. And the hood currently just has a instantiated version of the exact same material that the base part of the jacket is made up of. So we can go ahead and add our anisotropy angle and level here. And then that should immediately match, because we set this on the base layer of the instantiated texture here, it goes ahead and matches very nicely with this. Now, you can see that the angle is actually different here on these different parts of the hood because in the UVs, they are rotated in different directions. We could fix this by using a position map to drive the angle, but I'm not too concerned about it right now. Kind of looks nice, actually. Kind of like the way it looks. Next in the stage, we just have some general creasing. This is not masked at all, just some horizontal creases at a relatively high frequency, using this creases soft procedural with a blur on it, and the height reduced to about 17. We can see it's just some subtle folds being added in that were not part of the sculpt, but are now just giving a little extra information. Looks nice. So the next thing I'm doing is adding a little bit of roughness to the cavities. And this is subtle, but as I'm toggling this, you can see that the insides of these folds here are becoming much more rough. They're not picking up the highlight quite as much. For this, I'm just using the mask editor, and I've taken the curvature here and set the mode to cavities and turned down everything except for the soft, fine, and sharp settings here to get these cavities to kind of come through. From there, I added a edge wear layer, which, as you can see here, looks pretty grungy. It has a curvature component and a texture component being multiplied on top of it. The texture is grunge dirt scratched, and I've adjusted the balance a little bit to be lower than it is in stock. And this is being multiplied on top of this curvature, which is the raised portions of the curvature. And all this is really doing is reducing the roughness, it's reducing the blending mask component, and it's brightening the edges a little bit where there's been some wear. So in the diffuse, you can see the component is relatively mild, and then in the roughness, it's a little bit more extreme. And then in our blending mask, it's fairly subtle, but it's the only thing we have in there right now. Then I added a noise on top of this, just sort of a generic roughness noise. This is just using moisture noise, which I find to be very useful for shiny fabrics like this. And the roughness is turned down to about 46. It just gives it a little bit more breakup. It looks nice. And then a cavity mask here, which has only the blending mask component. If we take a look at that, we're just masking out all of the cavities in the tiling maps. So if we look at our blending mask here, that's what that's doing. So on top of that, I've added a dirt and damage layer. And this is fairly subtle. This is a what I would call general use dirt and damage. There's some leaks here. that is using the Grunge Leak Small procedural here in triplanar, and it looks fairly nice. It looks like, you know, maybe they went out in the rain, got a little mud on here, and the roughness component is set to higher. Thought that it might be sort of dried and old, so I increased the roughness, reduced the blending mask component so that less of the tiling is appearing there because there's a thicker surface on top of it, and set the color to sort of a dark brown. But the actual diffuse component is very subtle here if we look at the base color. Very subtle. Same thing in the roughness. It's a little bit more intense here. And in our blending map. And then on top of that, we have just sort of a general dirt. I use this Grunge Scratches Dirty, set the balance kind of low. And once again, this is on triplanar. Just some general dirt. None of this is major damage. We'll get into that a little bit later. You know, if we want to show some of the puff layer sort of coming through, that's going to be an entirely different sort of setup. Then I have a separate fabric here that I've created for the elastic bands. If we go ahead and look at this, it's very simple. I'm masking out all tiling information. And now we can actually take this anisotropy level. And we can set this to 0 here. And then we have a fibers texture that is sort of making up the elastic look of this, and some fuzz and pilling. The fuzz is just this messy fibers procedural, which I've created an anchor point for, so that for the tiling fibers, I can mask out some of the fuzz by multiplying this inverted kind of over the top of it. And then I can control the intensity here. So as I slide the intensity of this, you can kind of see it starting to mask out those fibers just a little bit to make it seem like there's some fuzz that is kind of sitting on top of that. And that's pretty much it. There's also an internal lining here, which is very sort of similar to this. It's just a rougher fabric that I've created to kind of fit into these spaces. There's separate UV islands. And then we have a lighting layer here. So what the lighting layer is doing, go ahead and look at our base color, because all of this is just on the base color. That's all we're doing here. So the first thing is a vertical gradient from top to bottom, just to get a nice sort of flow going. And we could make this a little bit more dramatic. We could go in and adjust the balance a little bit and the contrast, get a little bit more obvious. And I have a blue noise multiplied on top of this just to avoid any banding. Once again, in the base color. If we turn this off, we can start to see a little bit of banding. It's not too bad here. It's almost forgivable, but this just helps to break it up a little bit more and make it not quite as obvious. If we go into our full material here and we toggle this on and off, you can kind of see the impact that it has. Next, I'm multiplying the AO into the base very, very slightly. We don't want enough that it's going to affect lighting conditions. We just want to sort of occlude these areas very, very slightly all the time, even in full bright light. You know, we want just a little bit of occlusion there. And same thing with the curvature here. I have it set to overlay. And this is both brightening and darkening. So kind of making those edges pop a little bit and darkening the cavities just a little bit. You might even want to reduce this slightly. So we made a couple of changes. Let's go ahead and export. So you can see I made it much more shiny here, which I'm not a big fan of, but this was to offset some of the anisotropy in the toolbag shader. So let's go back. You can see there's a big difference here. Now the reason that the reflections aren't matching quite as nicely is that we actually have the anisotropy level set to 1 here in Painter. And if we look at toolbag, we can see the anisotropy is set to 0.695. So let's try mirroring that to see if it looks a little bit closer. Go ahead and set this to 0.695. And it's somewhat closer. It's a little bit darker. Unfortunately, toolbag and Painter have very different gloss curves. What happens to this value under the hood is very different. So it's a little bit difficult to kind of match them, but at least this is a little bit closer now that we've set this anisotropy value. You'll notice that I've also set the metalness on the base layer here higher than 0. This is generally sort of frowned upon in a metalness workflow, and it's definitely something that's easier to do in a specular workflow. But I wanted the specular reflections to be tinted slightly green. So if we take this all the way up, you can see that all of the reflections are green, right? And at 0, all of the reflections are white, which is not really what I wanted. So I sort of bumped this up to 0.3, which is not exactly metal and it's not exactly dielectric. It's kind of somewhere in the middle. This is definitely much easier to do with a spec gloss workflow, where you can just add a little bit of saturation but not change the value. But for the sake of this course, I wanted to keep everything in metal rough. So I've just increased this very, very slightly. There with that roughness component reduced a little bit. That's starting to look a little bit better. It's a good idea. We've instantiated these textures here to start your any textures that are going to be using that same instance by duplicating the base here. So the hood is actually missing some components. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete that material for now. And then I will duplicate the selected material and call this hood and apply it. And then we'll just go ahead and change the source maps to match correctly. We can just right click on this, copy, paste, and there we go. That's looking much better. Now we'll need this to tile quite a bit less because it has a higher texel density. So let's go ahead and set this to about half, maybe even lower. That's looking about right. And then we'll do the same in the tiling diffuse. There we go. Applying damage to clothing can be done quite successfully with the use of anchor points and a painted damage mask. If I go ahead and paint on the surface here, we can create a little pull between the seams here. All just using one painted mask. Let's go ahead and break this down and take a look at how it works. So at the bottom of the stack, in this fabric damage material, we have a painted mask. It simply looks like this. There's a warp filter on it to break up the edge quite a bit. As you can see, that helps give it some more interest. At the next stage, add a raised edge, which takes the anchor point from the painted mask here, blurs it ever so slightly because it's on a UV seam here. If we set the blur to 0 and then bevel it, you're less likely to get UV artifacts based on that seam, and then uses the levels to shrink it in a little bit. We can adjust this as we see fit. You can see as I bring the blacks up, it starts to tighten in, kind of look a little bit more like threading. On this layer, we have a color component. It's brightening just slightly. The height is increased to raise the edge. The normal is flattened out. And if we go to the normal stack, I have the blending mode set to normal instead of normal detail, which is the default. And what this is going to do is blend out the base normal map so that we're losing the seam that was sculpted in. And then the ambient occlusion is being set to 1 to have a raised white edge around the ambient occlusion. On the next layer, I'm adding some folds. If we toggle this on and off, you can kind of see what's happening here. Let's go ahead and rotate these real quick. Take a look at the impact here. So what this does is it takes the initial mask, bevels it out quite a bit, blurs it, and then multiplies creases soft over the top, blurs it again to soften that effect. You can see there's some sharp edges here, so it just softens that out. And then punching out the center by inverting the painted damage mask. So we get this sort of subtle, if we go to this height channel, we can see it's set to 58%. Some subtle folding kind of going on along the edge here. Now, unfortunately, because the creases are directional, if you paint in a different direction, they're going to look a little bit odd. You can see now they're horizontal across this, which isn't really what we want. So you would have to make some adjustments there depending on what you're doing. You might want to have 2 separate versions of this stack, one for horizontal and one for vertical, or just remove the folds entirely. We can go ahead and turn down the impact there. The next thing I'm doing, if we toggle this layer on and off, is creating a recession for the sort of cut here. And what this does is it fills in with the base mask, bevels it inwards and softens it quite a bit. And then I created an anchor point here to save this state. So I want to save this beveled and softened version of the initial mask. Then I multiplied fur3 over the top of it, which if we set this to normal, we can take a look at what this is. It's just a bunch of little fibers. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want to have a little bit of breakup on the edges of this. And ideally, where the pieces are closer together, I'm getting more of that so that it looks like it's sort of tearing at those edges. Then I'm filling it back in with this saved recession mask, recession saved. And then I'm using a levels to kind of pull it in quite a bit. We can take a look at what that looks like. Just to make the contrast between the recession and the raised portion much more intense. We can control that here with the levels. And then saving a mask for this, because inside we have some fraying going on, as you can see here. So what is this doing? This mask is very simple. It's just this recession mask. And inside, I have this fraying base, which has a base color and a little bit of height information, and is just this fur tiled across the body. I've used triplanar projection here because otherwise we get an ugly seam right there. So I'm using triplanar. And I have a horizontal one and a vertical one that are just kind of overlaid on top of each other inside of this group to sort of fill that space in. And that's pretty much it. It's fairly simple. We can toggle this on and off. And now we can go in, and anywhere we want this damage, we can just go to our paint layer here and just start sort of painting away. And the lighter we go with it, the more subtle sort of it starts to be. It's not really cutting out. And then the larger we get, the more we're going to cut in and get these seams happening. And we can go in with just like a really small brush and just kind of like trace some edges and get like a little bit of edge breakup if we want to do something like that. It's places where seams split slightly, or we can, really go intense and say something cut across his leg and created this sort of huge gash that we can take out. Now, if a cut is this large, typically it's going to need some additional support, right? As soon as we rotate the camera, we're not losing any volume here. So it just kind of looks plastered on the surface. If it's small enough like this, it works quite well, right? So how do we sort of take this to the next level? If we go over to Maya here, we can take a look at what's going on. I went ahead and with multi-cut just went in and traced the outline of this cut and then extruded those faces in. Keeping the UVs as similar as possible, I locked in where the initial cut of the UVs was and then just unfolded the center portion. That way it's not affecting UV stretch of any kind. And then from there, went ahead and created some fraying geo. So using a trim sheet that I have for fraying, I went ahead and added a bunch of cards here, and you can see there's some horizontal cards that look like this, that are just sort of a bunch of fibers laid across each other, like if you had torn a hole in the knee of your jeans, it would look something like this. And then just some simple fraying, which you can see here. If we move these out of the way, just some simple fraying, very similar to hair cards. And if we go over into Toolbag, you can see this really helps to sell this damage. And, using that material as a base and then having these added components over the top, this material is fairly simple. It's just using a dithered alpha and a little bit of volumetric scattering so that it looks nice and soft. Just helps to really sell that damage. Now we can do the same thing with our leather collar up here. We can use the same material. So when we're happy with the way that this fabric damage looks, we can go ahead and right click and say create smart material. And then if I go up to my collar here, you can see I have this damage I've gone ahead and painted in. And I have the fabric damage smart material that I've dragged in just from my library right here. And I've made a couple of modifications here. I modified the fraying and just removed it entirely. There's normally the fraying that we had on the previous material. And this just has the recession. And what I went ahead and did is I took this recession mask that we made, and in the layer mask for my black leather, I went ahead and added an inverted version of this recession mask and multiplied that on top. So now when I paint, I get this hide layer that's underneath. So we can go down to our paint layer here, and we can sort of paint in some damage. Looks like maybe a big sort of creature claw came in and got this piece. And if we wanted to, we could take this further and go into the bottom layer and add some damage to that bottom layer too. But this is just sort of the start of how you can work with height and anchor points to create some really interesting damage effects on your character. One way to take your cloth to the next level is to add fuzz cards. Now you might not be able to see this very well at a distance, but if we go ahead and look at the profile here, you can see some fuzz coming up off the edges. These are simply cards. If we turn on the wireframe, we can take a look at them, that are being extruded from the surface of the pants using an alpha map. And I'm just using some areas here, the tips of some of these fraying cards here, to create the illusion of some fuzz. This is something you might want to do for especially soft cloth, something that's going to have fibers that look like they come away from it. It's a nice way to add a level of depth to your cloth. Typically, you would want to do this with a shader solution and not by creating, this is roughly around 6,000 triangles worth of cards. But it's definitely something that you can do, especially for a portfolio piece, and it can look kind of nice. So let's take a look at how to do that. Here I have my pants in Maya, and I've gone ahead and saved this scene in a project. So before we start using XGen, which is what we're going to use to generate these cards, We'll have to go to File and Set Project and make sure that we're setting this project to the location where we're going to be working. So I'm in Week 8 Lecture Content, XGen, and I go ahead and set that. Now all of our textures are going to be saved to that location and all of the necessary XGen files. Now I've gone ahead and created something here already, but let's kind of go through the process of how I did this. To bring up the XGen Interactive Groom Editor, I went to the workspace bar up here and selected XGen Interactive Groom. From there, we can go ahead and click on our pants here and say Create Interactive Groom Splines. And since I already have one called Pants Fuzz, I'm just going to call this Pants Fuzz Demo. I'm going to go ahead and leave all of these at default, but I'm going to change the CV count to 4. We'll go ahead and hit Create. After a few seconds, we should get essentially what looks like fur covering our garment. This is a little bit on the intense side, but if you wanted to, you could probably just export this and set it to a very soft dithered alpha shader. And this would work fairly well. But let's use a card solution that's going to be a little bit more performant. Maybe it's closer to something you could potentially use in a game engine. So we'll go ahead and open this folder it creates for us and go down to Pants Fuzz Demo Base and then open up the attribute editor here. And the first thing we want to do is set our density multiplier. I'm going to set this to 0.05. And you can see the coverage drops dramatically, but consistently. Versus if we adjust this density mask here, if I set this back to 1, and I set the mask here to 0.05, you can see that there's more in certain areas. It's following kind of the curvature. If that's something you want, you can go ahead and do that, but we're actually going to use this mask here as what it says. We're going to create a mask for where we don't want these splines to appear. So I'll go ahead and set the density multiplier to 0.05 and set the mask back to 1. And then go ahead and hit this paintbrush here, which is going to ask us where we want to put a texture for this. I'm going to go ahead and call this mask Pants Fuzz Density. Leaving it as IFF is fine, and then I'm going to save it into the source images location in my XGen folder. You can really save this anywhere. Somewhere that makes sense to you. I'll leave the size at 1024, that's fine. Starting color is white is good. And we want to use map 1 because we only have the one UV set. So I'll go ahead and hit create. So this gives us a white texture where we can go ahead and draw on this now. Switch my thing back to ACES. So if we go into our tool settings here, I'll just double click on this last tool used here to bring up the tool settings for my 3D paint tool, and I'm going to set the profile to this solid brush so that I'm not getting any sort of fall off on this, because I really want it to be white or black. We don't want any gray values in our density mask necessarily, or it may not act the way we want it to. You can do that for hair, but for this I think you'll want it to be either on or off. If you're using a brush, you might want to turn off stylus pressure. We can also turn on reflection if we want to, if it's perfectly symmetrical. In this case, it's not. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to paint out these pockets because I don't want any fibers sort of spawning in the pockets. It's just going to be a waste because we really just want to kind of see this on the silhouette. So I'll go ahead and paint in here, removing these. There we go. And same thing here. Paint right inside there. And then do the same on top here. I don't want anything sort of spawning on top. You can hold Control to invert the brush. We want to paint some of this back in. Great. Okay. That's pretty good. And then I also have this fly here where things can get a little tricky because there's geometry that goes down inside the fly. So I'm just going to go ahead and paint this portion out as well. Okay, with that done, I'll scroll to the File Textures location in the brush settings and hit Save Textures. So now we can go into the sort of root node of our description here. And I'm going to set the width scale up a bit higher to start looking like a card. And that's looking pretty good. It's about what we're looking for. I want it to be slightly rectangular because I know that my textures are not perfectly square, so this kind of works. And you can see as I rotate that they're actually rotating to face the camera. So we can turn off face camera here to get kind of a better idea of what a geometry conversion would look like of these primitives. Right now they're just sort of primitives that don't exist. We can't really click on them. Right? They're kind of being created under the hood. So from here, we'll go ahead to the Add Modifier button, and I'm going to add a sculpt layer. I'm going to go to the XGen tab up here and grab my comb brush. And then in the settings for the comb brush, I'm going to set Collide with Meshes to on, which is going to make these, it's going to make sure that my primitives collide with my base mesh here on my pants. And I'll have the distance set to about 0.5. And I'm just going to start. Oh, and I need to make sure that I'm clicking on the sculpt layer here and that I hit the edit button. And then I'm just going to start combing these downwards. Not too worried about the rotation right now. We're going to fix that in a minute, but I just want them to flow with gravity a little bit. So I'm combing them downwards. And we can set a really big brush and just kind of do this. And you can see that the collision sort of happening as I'm pulling them down, kind of keeping them from penetrating through. If we go to the tool settings here and we turn off Collide with Meshes, you can see they just kind of go straight through and they really flatten out. Collide with Meshes is really good for making sure that that does not happen. So with that done, we'll go ahead and add another sculpt layer. This one's called Sculpt 4. We can rename it. I'm going to rename this to Twist, and the one below it to Comb. And in this Twist layer, luckily it's already set to edit because we just created it. I'm going to grab the Twist brush here, the Twist tool, and in the settings, I'm going to change from the defaults to Align with Surface. I'm going to check that. And I'm going to set Flood Mode to All and hit Flood. And what this is going to do is it's going to rotate all of these primitives to face the normal of my pants here. You can see it's not perfect. Some of them are kind of flipped a different way. There's a little bit of warping at the root here. Not a huge deal. We're probably not going to see them too well. We're actually going to remove a bunch of the spans that XGen automatically creates for us. So that's pretty good. We could spend some more time grooming this. You could add some noise or different effects. It's really up to you, but for our purposes, this is going to work just fine. So what I'm going to do now is select my Pants Fuzz demo description over here and go to the Generate menu and go to Convert Interactive Groom to Polygons. In this dialog, I'm going to have Combine Mesh checked. I'm going to have Use Width Ramp unchecked and Insert Spans Along Width unchecked, and set the UV layout type to 2x2 and go ahead and hit Convert. And now we get a bunch of cards. We can turn off the groom here with this little visibility icon, and now we can see exactly what the cards look like. So now we need to UV these to work well with our fuzz map. So I'll go ahead and apply this material. I already have it set up so that it has the transparency on it, as you can see here. And by default, it has arranged all of our cards here into the 0 to 1 space into 4 different regions. So we have 4 different variations we can kind of create. You can add more by modifying those settings. I'm fine with 4. So the first thing I'm going to do is, using this menu, I'm going to select all of the internal edges on these cards, and you can see them selecting over here. I don't really need these additional edges, and they're just kind of wasting some space for me. You can see our triangle count right now is at 17,600. I'm just going to go ahead and delete these. And now we're at 5,800, much better. And those were really just kind of a waste. You could leave them in some key areas if you want to, or just one, and that's still going to help quite a bit. So go ahead and clear the history. And then I'm going to start moving these around to fit into my texture sheet here. Now, the first thing we want to do is figure out where the root UVs are. They appear to be on the bottom, and we want them to be left to right. So I'm just going to rotate these around here. Doesn't have to be precise. And then start shrinking them down. And I'm going to use this fuzz here. And we could take up the whole thing. Could do something like this. This is a little bit hard to see, but we could do something like this, where most of the fuzz, lots of different fibers in there. Instead, I'm going to shrink these even smaller, I think, and get a little variation out of this one specific sort of texture region. And shrink this down, move it into place. I get these sort of double fibers, and let's get another one here. Maybe something like this. 3 over here to create another, and it's okay that it's kind of terminating into here. We're really not going to be able to see that super well. And then let's get one more. I can go ahead and rotate this a little bit. Kind of fit my needs. And there we go. Now we have a bunch of fuzz. You can see it very clearly here in Maya. You can see the different kinds of fuzz. So we've got some variation. We've got our UV set up. But there's some normal errors going on here. You can see some darker spots. So let's transfer the vertex normals from the pants to the cards. So I'll select the pants and then the cards. Go to Mesh, Transfer Attributes. And we want vertex normals on in world space, closest to point. And I'll go ahead and hit Apply. And if we turn off texture mode here, and the reason we're seeing these so well is because the material itself is set to black. But if we bring this up a little bit, now you can see that the lighting is much more similar to how our pants are lighting, which is good because we really want to only see these on the silhouette. So with that done, let's go ahead and export these over to Toolbag. Go to Export Selection and export as an FBX into my Bake Meshes folder, and I want this pants fuzz test. I'll go ahead and export that. Now over in Toolbag, we get these white cards, and I've gone ahead and created this pants fraying material already, which we can drag over onto here. And what we want to do is make sure that cast shadows is turned off, because we don't really want them to cast shadows. They're supposed to be very light fibers, right? And then make sure that cull back faces is also turned off because we want to be able to see those back faces. And now we've got these nice fuzz meshes that are very subtle, but just add a little bit of extra depth. I have the shader set up to use transmission and the scatter depth set to about 0.25. And the rest is pretty standard. There's an occlusion map and the alpha map here, and I have it set to dithered. If you set it to cutout, it looks much more intense, but you do get this nice threshold control so that you can control how visible it is. And it's a little bit easier to see that way. If you want it to be kind of a rougher fabric, you can do that. It also helps to lengthen these. And we can go ahead and set this back to dithered real quick. But in some cases, we might want them to be longer or larger. So what we can do is go back to Maya, and we'll go to our UVs again. And I'm just going to select the bottom edge of all of these islands. And I can go to edit mesh, transform. And that's going to give me a transform handle for each of these individual edges. And I can go ahead and pull this out and sort of scale it a little bit. If we wanted to, we could select all of the edges or all of the verts and go to edit mesh, transform. Click one of the scale ends, and that will reveal the center scale. And then we can center scale them. Now we're going to get an even more intense fuzz out of this. So we can go ahead and export these again. And there we can see now we have some very intense fuzz coming off of this. It doesn't particularly make sense, but it's kind of cool. Generally, you'll want this to be a little bit more subtle. We could turn down the alpha a little bit if we wanted to. And then that makes it a little bit more subtle. But there we go. You can use this in a lot of different ways. This actually works great on skin as well for creating peach fuzz. XGen is a very useful tool for being able to create stuff like this. The first method I like to use for creating fur for games is to simply use XGen. A lot of engines now will accept alembic caches of spline hair groomed from XGen. Unfortunately, Marmoset Toolbag does not, so here's a few tips for converting your XGen groom into usable geometry for Marmoset Toolbag. Unfortunately, grooming fur is not part of the scope of this course, but I will show you some tips for converting this into usable geometry. So to start, I'll go ahead and go to the Preview/Output tab of XGen and create a MEL file. By default, this is set to render, but I'll switch it to create MEL file and then export that into my project folder. From there, I can import that MEL file, which is going to give me a series of curves. If we go ahead and turn off the XGen preview and the guides, we can see the Maya curves. From there, I selected all of these curves, and it's roughly 6,000 curves, and converted them into a sweep mesh using the Create Sweep Mesh option. If we go ahead and hide the curves and show the sweep mesh, you can see that as I modify one of the sweeps, it updates all of these meshes. So there's one sweep mesh creator node for all of these. I can go ahead and set the scale profile to something like 0.1, and they're going to get much thicker, as you can see here. And I can modify the taper and the twist. And I've gone ahead and set the precision mode to 85%. And optimize this checked. And I'm using arc mode here because I don't really need a back face. And I set the segments to 2 so that I just get this nice little arc here. And that gives me somewhere in the neighborhood of 400,000 triangles for this fur. Now, this isn't really something that you would use in a game engine. The game engine is going to take your Alembic cache and be much more efficient with it by creating B-splines. But this is a good approximation for Toolbag and should work just fine. And from there, we can go ahead and combine it and clear the history on it. And once we're happy with how it's looking with our sweep mesh settings. And I went ahead and UV'd it, stacked the UVs. After laying them out, I sort of stacked a group of them in different vertical sections, and I'll show you why in a sec. And I also transferred the normals from a torus. So I took this torus and scaled it up, and then froze its transforms, and then selected the torus and then the sweep mesh, and transferred the vertex normals of the torus to the sweep mesh, which takes a second, but then we can go ahead and clear the history and take a look. And that gives us this nice sort of anisotropic and consistent lighting. Now, if I go ahead and unlock the normals, we can see what it looked like before. The lighting is very broken up. Each curve is lit uniquely, which may be more accurate for fur. You can kind of play it by ear. I prefer the isotropic lighting, and I'll kind of show you why. It's typically used for hair, and it can look really nice. So with that done, we can go ahead and export this geometry into Toolbag. Here we are in Toolbag with our fur mesh. And let's take a look at the shader here. So I have this albedo map that has 4 different color regions. And then I'm multiplying, using this color box here, a sort of very light, slightly saturated orange onto it to kind of control this color a little bit more. And this just allows me to kind of have a little bit more fun with this, be able to pick kind of whatever colors I want for it. Obviously, we could get more in depth with this and add gradients, like root to tip gradients and all that kind of stuff. There's no normal map. I'm just kind of letting the geometry drive a lot of the information here. I set the transmission to volumetric scattering, which allows us to get a nice little bit of backscattering here from the light passing through it. And that looks really nice. I also have the fuzz set slightly just to get a little bit more indication of light passing through it. It just looks kind of nice. And then I have the reflection mode set to anisotropic instead of GGX. So if we go ahead and bring this roughness down, you can start to see this anisotropic highlight here. This looks especially good with card hair, and you can kind of mess with the direction here. I have it set to 90 degrees so that it kind of cuts right through the center of this. And then once we set the roughness fairly high, you just get this nice highlight sort of running through the fur. And then finally, I have dithered alpha turned on in the transparency section. I'll uncheck use albedo alpha here and alpha map. And I just have the alpha set to 0.81. So you can see that like as I slide this, it starts to get really nice and soft. And we can kind of control that here. Obviously, we're starting to see through it far too much at lower values where it does get softer. But just pulling it back to somewhere around 0.8 really starts to soften it up and it looks nice. We could probably get it even softer by having a smaller curve profile for the sweep mesh, and maybe even using tubes here instead of the arc. But this works fairly well. And we also need to make sure that cull back faces is turned off so that we can see these undersides here. Otherwise we get kind of a see-through patch. And there we have it. That's pretty simple, assuming you know how to use XGen. I highly recommend you check out some of CGMA's other courses that do go over this. And I would be happy to do a live demo of this later this week. If that's something that you're interested in, please let me know. Next, let's go over the shell method of creating fur. Another method of creating fur for games is the shell method. We essentially take the geometry and duplicate it multiple times, kind of like we did with our zippers, to create the illusion of thick fur. This really only works with short fur. Longer fur gets a little bit tricky. And I've gone ahead and created a Sherpa collar here for my hunter, just in case he gets a little cold out there fighting demons. Let's take a look at sort of how this was created. So to begin with, in Maya here, if we go ahead and hide the head, I have several shells here, 4 shells, stacked on top of each other of the collar. And I have UV'd them in different quadrants. So I have 4 quadrants here that I've UV'd them into, starting with the lower right on the bottom. The lower left is the next shell, and then the upper left is the top shell. If we go into Photoshop, we can see how the textures were created. Now, I actually got this from Marvelous Designer. In Marvelous Designer here, we can see I've just created a simple flat plane here, and I applied from the fabric library the Sherpa sheepskin fleece. And inside of this material that I've applied here, you can see that there is a texture, and if we click the little window here, there's a full set of textures for this Sherpa. So we can go ahead and bring these into Photoshop. So here I am in Photoshop, and I've divided the texture here into quadrants, just as I've divided my shell UVs into quadrants. And I have the albedo from Marvelous Designer that I've sort of recolored a little bit, and I tiled it a couple times. And then I have the height map, which is also included with Marvelous Designer. And I use that height map to create an alpha map. So in each quadrant here, the alpha is slowly getting reduced. So at the base level, we're full white. We want it to render entirely. And then I've just used levels here to adjust the height map to create different stacks of alpha. So that at the top, we're only seeing these little white flecks. In the middle level here, we have a little bit more content and more, and then we're fully rendered. And then there's a normal map used to get some surface variation. So let's go back to Toolbag and see how the shader's set up. So if you look closely here, you can kind of see the individual shells. It's not super noticeable, but there's a few things we can do about that. First, let's go ahead and dive into this shader. So at the top here, I've enabled displacement and chosen height. And I set the scale center to 0, and then I can control the scale here. Now obviously this is getting pretty faceted and polygonal, and what we can do is if we select our geometry here, and we turn off cold back faces to begin with, because we want to be able to see those, we can actually enable subdivision here, and set the number of subdivisions we want, and that's going to soften that. Obviously this is a little bit too intense, but we can grab this scale and bring it down, and get something that just sort of softens out this look. Very nice. And then from there, we have our normal map, very simple, our albedo map. I went in, and because I was thinking my albedo was a little too dark, I just turned off this sRGB color space, and what that does is it changes it to linear, so that just brightens it. And this is kind of a hack. What I should have done is gone back into Photoshop and adjusted the levels, but I didn't feel like doing that, so I just turned that off, and then I've gone in here and multiplied a color over the top of it. So just to control that color in the shader rather than going back into Photoshop. Now what I can do next is go to my transparency settings here, set it to dither, turn off use albedo map, turn on alpha map, and change the channel from alpha, which is by default, to red channel because I have this as a separate mask. And then I can control this alpha, and especially with the dithering, it looks nice and soft. If we switch this to cut, you can see it's much sharper. This is a little bit more like what you're going to get in a game engine, though you can get dithering. Cutout is much more common, but because we're in Toolbag, we can go ahead and dither, and it looks really nice. Now we can take this to the next level, and under diffusion, let's go ahead and add microfiber. And we're getting some really intense sheen here. But we can modify the roughness of this. And it starts to look nice and fuzzy. Fantastic. So now our hunter will be nice and warm as he's out slaying ungodly horrors in Yharnam. I picked up this technique from Joost van Hout. Yost, I apologize if I got your name wrong, but this has been on Polycount for quite a while and was used in Marmoset Toolbag 3. And it's a really great technique that is used widely in the industry. Ratchet's fur is created this way that it's done in a shader, and it's just a great way to get some subtle fur that, as long as it's very short fur. So thanks again to Joost van Hout. So before we go into posing our characters, I want to set a couple of ground rules or just some ideas in your head to think about. The first is that unless you're an animator, you really shouldn't be getting too involved with this pose. You shouldn't be creating some kind of action pose or extreme pose that is going to move the geometry out of its bind pose state too far. If we do something like that, we're going to get a lot of geometry stretching. We make it something that isn't very naturalistic and in most cases won't fit nicely into frame. And the reason we're kind of looking at Spider-Man here is that this idle pose was created by one of our animators at Insomniac. And it's incredibly good for renders because you can see the entire character. He's not moved too far out of bind pose, so we're not seeing a lot of geometry stretching on the rig. And it's fairly simple, right? But it does give you the essence of the character. He feels very heroic, and he's kind of showing off his costume. What we really don't want to do is create a really dramatic, over-the-top pose, because that's going to take away from all of the other character work that we've already done, unless we really know what we're doing when it comes to posing and animating. If you are an animator, or if you have a friend who's an animator and you want to have them kind of work on it, that's absolutely okay. But for the sake of this course, I would highly recommend that your pose be very, very simple. If we look at my hunter here, really all he's going to be doing is posing into having his hat pulled down a little bit, so that he's sort of looking into the camera menacingly. You can see it's a very simple pose, and I'm not really, taking the joints and stretching them out to be these sort of like fantastic fight pose or anything. I'm not trying to make him kick. We could, but you can already start to see some of the problems with this, right? So think about that as you're posing. Think about what's going to fit the character and how it's going to look in your portfolio. In a production environment, character artists should not be doing any posing sort of anyway, unless you're on a very small team. And if that's the case, then, I imagine you're going to have to be pretty good at it. So investing the time into that would be very important. So as we move forward into a couple different methods of creating some posing, think about how you can make your pose elegant and simple, but still sort of show your target audience what your character is, who they are, what their sort of story is. When it comes to posing, probably the simplest or quick and dirty method would be to use Transpose Master. I'm going to go ahead and just drag out a generic mesh here, and then go to Z plugin menu and FBX export import, and go ahead and import my low-res mesh that I've sent into Painter. And we'll give this a second to populate. It's going to give me a subtool for each one of my separate meshes. There we go. And we can go ahead and turn on our perspective here, and we have all of our low-res meshes. Now, what we may need to do is go back and make sure that we don't have any n-gons anywhere. As you can see, I have a couple of n-gons here that ZBrush went ahead and ignored, and it just removed it. So if you're getting holes like that, it's because you have some n-gons that you'll need to go ahead and clean up. So in order to pose this, we can use Transpose Master. We'll go back to the Z plugin menu and down to Transpose Master. Now, normally what this is going to do is, if you have subdivisions, it's going to drop all of your subtools to the lowest subdivision and then combine them into a single mesh. Now, we don't have subdivisions, but we still kind of want to use it to combine this all into one mesh so that we can pose it as a unified mesh and then split it back up into its separate pieces. So I'll go ahead and hit the T-pose mesh button so that it creates our merged subtool. There we go. And you can see we have a poly group for each separate mesh here. So we can go ahead and grab our gizmo here, and I'll press Y to change it back to the transpose brush. And we could do something like move the arm up. So if we go ahead and solo the duster and the gloves here, switch to select lasso and just select that. And use mask lasso to go ahead and lasso the arm here. And I'll just blur that mask a little bit. And then we can go ahead and raise the arm a little. If we use this center dot, we can rotate along the length of this transpose, which is kind of useful. And obviously this is going to take quite a bit of time if you have a lot of pieces, but it does allow you to be very specific about your posing. So you can still go in with all of your standard ZBrush tools and adjust this. So once we rotate the elbow up here, we can switch to our move tool and kind of pull this back out. You know, we're not having to deal with skinning necessarily if we set up a rig, and we can, you know, go through and pose this in hopefully a way that we're happy with. And let's go ahead and just make some adjustments to the duster here. I'll use move topological to sort of pull it away. You can see I'm running into some issues here where the pockets are separate meshes, so instead of using move topological, just go ahead and select this and mask off the region that I want to be able to edit, and then invert my mask. Now I can just use the regular move brush, and we could say we want this to look like it's kind of, I don't know, blowing in the wind or something, right? This is going to take quite a bit of time. It's definitely not the easiest method. It is probably the simplest method because you don't need to have a lot of technical know-how to be able to do this. You can kind of move your stuff around, and then when you're done, you go back to the Z plugin menu and say T-pose sub T, which is going to move all of these back into its separate subtools. Now we have the arm posed and this sort of fake wind thing going on. And I'm not spending a lot of time on this because, as you might be able to tell, this is not my preferred method of posing, but it's definitely something you can use. Then we can go ahead and export this as an FBX. I'll go into my options here. I'm going to turn off export polygroups as mats because I don't want this. I don't want any additional materials exported from this. And from there, we'll make sure that all is checked here and go ahead and export this as our hunter posed. Now, unfortunately, with the way that FBX works, if we just imported that FBX into this scene, it would replace the meshes rather than giving us new additional meshes. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is just select all of my meshes here. I have them visible in the scene, so I'll just select all of them. And I'm going to go up to Modify, Search and Replace Names, and I'm going to search for low, because I know they all have the word low in there, and I'm going to replace that with static. And I'll go ahead and hit replace. So now we have this. All these meshes are called static. And we'll want to make sure that we're done with our baking and texturing at this point so that this naming conflict isn't going to cause any issues, or we can go ahead and save this as a totally separate file, which is probably what we should do. Then we can go ahead and import, and now we have all of these separate meshes. So first thing to note is that the materials are not going to be the correct material. And we also don't have our shading groups. So any hard edges that you've set or anything like that, we don't have. So what we will want to do is take these new meshes and apply them as blend shapes to our previous meshes, and then we can just go ahead and toggle those blend shapes on. And then that's how we're going to finalize our pose, is we're going to enable these blend shapes and then go ahead and export this new file as an FBX. You can see we had some issues here. And after doing that, we can go ahead and export that to Toolbag, and we'll have something posed. Now, you're probably thinking, transpose master seems like a hassle. I've heard of Z-sphere rigs, where we use Z-spheres to essentially create a series of joints for this guy and move those around. However, if we're going to create a rig, we might as well not do it in ZBrush. ZBrush does not have a lot of control over our rigs, and it's not going to be terribly useful for us. So let's go ahead and look at what we would do with